so far?
Good. We pass around the sign-in sheet.
I don't need it.
Okay.
I locked my keys in my car, so I have
no.
spare to use, thankfully.
I did that recently, and I was actually like smart for once. I had spare keys in my desk here.
Yeah.
So I grabbed my bike and biked over here, and I knew even if I didn't have my wallet, security would let me in. But I have my wallet, just not my car keys. All right, so I want to talk about Intellij and wrap up a few things with that, and then we're going to start talking about Eclipse, and we're going to switch gears to Eclipse, and I've decided we're going to use Eclipse for programming assignment 3 and probably 4 and 5 also. I've gotten feedback from a few people. I've had a few people come to my office, and the Intellij experience is just not seeming very consistent. I struggled with it a lot to get it working over break, and I finally got it to where I could use it, and it worked very consistently. But the things that I had to do to get to that point don't seem to work for other people's setups all the time. So if you're running on OS X or you have a different version of Java installed, there may be different things that have to be figured out. And it's too many branches on this tree. Eclipse has always had its quirks, but the quirks seem to be understandable and seem to be the same across the board. So we're going to talk about Eclipse and play around with Eclipse for a little bit to get a feel for what that looks like. And what I told the morning class, and I'll tell you right now, is we'll talk about how to install Eclipse on your own equipment and how to install a JDK. And my hope is that you will try to do that before class tomorrow, so that if it's not working for you, you can come in during the class time, either morning or afternoon or both, which is going to be like open lab, and we can work on it in here. And if I can find someone who wants to volunteer who does not have any of this installed on their laptop yet but wants to install it, we can hook them up to the screen, we can go through step by step the installation process and take notes and so on and so forth. My problem is I've got multiple versions of all this stuff already installed and running on my system. So if I try to see what's going to happen when you download Eclipse and this thing and you try to install them, I can't replicate it on my system unless I totally erase everything, which I tried somewhat last night on a Windows machine, but it still knew some of the stuff I had put in before. So we'll play around with that tomorrow, or of course if you have things related to PA2 tomorrow that you want to work on or ask questions about, that's always available there. So let's do a little more with Intellij.
That's a shame, because I got basically what the GUI of the...
Yeah, I figured. Which I think you'll be able to reuse in Eclipse.
Okay. And by the way, my code just edited the part out about the multiple listeners, and it only had button 1 and 2.
Okay. Did you get my note, my reply to your question?
I saw the reply to the
Okay.
question.
I was going to run through that in here also. Now, did we succeed in picking up mouse events? Yes, we did, right? Okay. The morning class I didn't. All right, so I'm going to click through, and I'm just going to make an Untitled 2 project. And I'm going to expand this, come down to source, right click, and I'm going to say new dialog. And I'll call it main. Take out those handlers. And so I think the main punchline from various experiments is if you want to add your own version of, say, a JPanel, you got to create the thing first, and then you can come over here to non-palette component and drag it in. If you try to drag this in first, call it a my panel before you've actually created the class, then even after you create the class, it doesn't want to work with it. It's already done some things based on the fact that it didn't know what the class was. and I haven't found a way to undo those. It comes down to trying to clear this custom create checkbox, and it doesn't clear for some reason. And I spent a while last night researching this, and it seems other people have run into this with various suggested remedies. So let me just illustrate something that came up in discussion group, which is if you have 3 buttons, you can select all 3 of them and say create a listener, and let's do an action listener for action performed. And we're going to write a single piece of code which is going to be called whenever any of these buttons get clicked. I know, thanks. I forget that I'm in VI here, so the S was the insert command. Alright, so how is this happening? We're defining an action listener, a new action listener called listener. It's got that code in it. So listener is basically, it's an action listener, it's a thing, it's an object. But then there's 3 calls down here that say add that as an action listener to all 3 of these objects. Right, that's why any of these 3 buttons, when you click it, are going to call the same piece of code. So you do have to be on this window when you say run the first time. If you're on a different window, you have an option for edit configurations, which I don't know what you're supposed to do here, but it doesn't seem to be anything meaningful to me. But if you're on the actual class that contains your main, and then you say run, it gives you an option to say, do you want to run from main? And then it'll remember that one for future use. So this runs, and there's your 3 buttons, and any one of them fires this code. So, so the question that came up in discussion is, if you do this, how do you know which button was pressed? Because each button calls the same piece of code. Now, your alternative is to create a separate handler for each button, but if you have 12 or 15 buttons, that's 15 handlers. You can do that, okay, but it's a little more work. So when an action is performed, we're given an action event, and if you look at what an action event is, it's an event which is an event object, which is an object. And if you look at the methods, there's not a lot of methods here, but it gets some methods from some of the classes it extends. And there's one method down here which is getSource. And if you say getSource, it basically tells you what the object was on which the event occurred. So that will give you the identity of the button that was clicked when this method was called. And getSource returns an object. So if we come back in here, we can say action event.getSource. And let's concatenate that to our print message. So if I click the first button, it says button equals, and there's some big long description. If I click the second one, it gives this. If I click the third one, it gives this.
There's a 0, 30, and 60.
0, 30, and 60. So what do you think those are?
Identifiers?
In a sense. Did somebody say something else? Yeah, those are y coordinates. So 0, 0, 0, 30, 0, 60, those are x and y coordinates, presumably for the upper left corner. So that's one way to tell which is which, although if they move around, that's not going to be very stable. All the way over here on the end, there's this thing text, which says text equals button. And that's actually coming from, if you click on a button, there's a text field which says what should we display on the button. So if this was labeled 0, and if this was labeled 1 and this was labeled 2, and we run this, zero, 1, 2. If you look over here, text equals 0, text equals 1, text equals 2. So how do we find that text field? I'm going to fix my doc so I don't have to do that in 2 steps. So if you look at the methods, there's nothing useful in there, but it's an abstract button which has a getText method. GetText returns the button's text. So go back to our code and let's do action event.getSource.getText. And it doesn't like that. And if you hover over it, it'll tell you that it can't resolve that method. Because action event.getSource returns an object. And objects don't have a getText method. Now why does it return an object? Because a J button is an object. It's also a J button. It's also an abstract button. It's also a component, right? It's this end of this big hierarchy of extensions. But getSource doesn't know what it's going to return. It can't just return a J button, because if you get the source and it's not a J button, it can't return that. So it returns the most general type of thing, which is an object. But even though it's an object, it has a getText method, but the compiler doesn't know this. It just knows that this thing on the left is an object, and we're trying to use a getText from an object. So this is where we do some casting. Casting is appropriate when you know that this is also that. You can cast this to that. So you've got the number 2, which is a double precision floating point, but you know that it's also an integer. You can cast it as an int. And now you can use it where something is expecting an int. So same thing here. So how do we cast parentheses and the type of thing that you want to cast to? So parentheses J button, and it's going to make me Alt-Enter. No, it's an uppercase B, I think. Okay, so it's a J button. And it's still not happy because I'm trying to cast all of this as a J button, so we need some more parentheses. So there's the cast, there's action getSource, close paren, that's what we want to cast. Now everything in these parentheses is a J button, and we can call the getText method on that. So after all of that, go ahead and run your code. There's button 0, there's button 1, there's button 2. And this getText returns a string, but we could pass that to integer.parseInt and turn it into an int, as long as we believe that the label's going to be a decimal number, right? And then we could have an integer, and we could use that however we want to use it. So that can be potentially very useful in making a calculator program where you've got 10 buttons that are all going to basically do the same thing, right? Just with a different digit value. But then at this point, we say goodbye to Intellij for a while. Sadness. But gone but not forgotten. So I've been told by a few students at WSU that there's no real mandate in the CS program as to what kind of IDE you use. And some people use Eclipse, some people use Intellij, some people will stick to the command line. And they use VI and they use Java and Java-C. Yeah?
Anything about Apple and the applets?
Like what?
Like program development and app. And I heard there was a specific Apple related coding program that only runs on Apple computers.
I believe, I don't know if it only runs on Apple, but it's specifically for creating apps for Apple. And I'm not familiar with that. But yeah, there is such a thing. And so there's numerous IDEs. There's Intellij we've been playing with. There's Eclipse we're going to talk about now. There's NetBeans, which we will talk about later. There's Xcode or whatever it is for making Apple applications. There used to be Android Studio. Android Studio is now basically Intellij. There's all these different environments, and they're very, very similar to each other. Okay, so when you write a calculator program using Intellij or using Eclipse or using NetBeans, the code that you're writing is going to be almost the same. What's going to differ is the process that you use for designing the GUI, for putting buttons down, for creating listeners for different components and so on and so forth. But the code that you use to interact with these things is going to be basically the same. And typically, you get to a school, you get to a job, you get to a contract, and you may be told, okay, you've got to use Intellij version such and such for this. And next week you come in and there's a new CEO, and now you got to use Eclipse because someone decided that's what we're using. And this is just kind of part of the deal. And it becomes a pretty much non-event. If someone says, okay, now you're going to use this thing that you've never used before, you're going to use Sublime or whatever, right? Well, you sit down for a few hours and you work through the basic translation from what you know to this new thing, and you go forward with that. And it's the same with programming languages. Someone says, okay, we've been doing Python all this time, and now we're going to do Ruby. And it's like, I don't know what Ruby is. Well, so you find some tutorials, or you find the reference, and you play around with it for a few hours or a day, and you learn it, and you just work with that. But if you've already learned, several object-oriented languages and procedural languages and all these kinds of mechanisms that we use, picking up a new language, it's just kind of like different mechanics, right? It's like renting a car. You can rent a car that you've never driven before, and usually you can still drive it, right? You've never been in a Saab, but you know how to drive cars. So yeah, the steering's a little different, the pedals work a little more, sensitive or something, and it becomes not a big deal. So the more exposure you get to these things, the better. So this is why I had originally thought of doing 3 IDEs. I just thought Intellij was going to be our main one, but we're going to switch that up. So here's the deal. We need a few pieces to be able to do this. So you need Java on your system, and Java comes in 2 main components. The Java Development Kit and the Java Runtime Environment. The runtime environment is I just want to execute Java. So it's basically the command Java that lets you go ahead and run the virtual machine. It doesn't let you compile things. Okay, it's assuming that you just want to run things that already exist. The Java Development Kit, that's what we want. That's what programmers use. That includes Java-C for compiling, JDB for debugging, jar for creating archives out of classes, and so on and so forth. JavaDoc for creating documentation. So when you download Java, you want the JDK as opposed to the JRE. So I'll just do Java download, and java.com is a good safe source. And download free Java software. So there's different versions of Java available, and I'm going to say you want version 8, ideally version 9 if you want to push it, but I'm going to suggest don't use version 10 or 11 or 12. Because last year when we tried to use Eclipse with version 10, things broke for various unfortunate reasons. So I've used Eclipse extensively with the version 8 JDK, and it's pretty solid. I've tested it with version 9, and that seems to work well also. Beyond that, you're taking chances. Okay, including the possibility that if you use the latest version of Java, it may not work when I'm running your code to try to grade your assignments. So don't go above version 9. Now if you already have a newer version of Java running on your system, that should be okay. Inside Eclipse you can point it to a particular JDK. and you just say, you know, download the version 8 JDK and use that one inside Eclipse. And it keeps it more portable than perhaps some of the newer ones. So I'm on Linux, so if you're doing Linux, right, you're just going to go and you're going to get the Linux 64 RPM, and I think, or this one up here, probably a tar file, not the RPM, unless you're using Red Hat. Sorry?
Not the RPM.
Yeah, RPM is for Red Hat, basically. So if we go on all Java downloads, you've got different versions here for Windows and so on. But I'm not sure what version of Java this is using. I think it's version 8, so this is a good one. No, that's pretty easy. All right, depending on what links you follow and what you click through, I think if you do this directly on a Windows machine, it brings you to a different looking page. And on that one, if you try to download version 8 of the JDK, it brings you to an Oracle login page. Okay, and it says put in your username and password for your Oracle account. And apparently if you try to download a version 8, it's old enough that they consider it to be end of life. And anytime you download an obsolete package, they want you to log in. I don't know why. Nobody seems to know why. So you have to create an Oracle account. Okay, it's free. I haven't gotten any spam yet, but you click the create account button and put in an email address. It's got to be valid so they can send you a link. Pick a password, follow the little password rules, and then it wants, you know, your name and your title and your address and all this kind of stuff. And as far as I can tell, you can fill that in with whatever you want. It doesn't have to be valid information. And as soon as you finish that, then it goes ahead and it downloads the file. And you run that file and it should install the JDK for you. If you already have JDK 8 or 9 installed, you don't have to do any of this. So as I said, if somebody wants to do this tomorrow in class, we can put it up on the screen and go through the steps and nail down exactly what the process is. But it's not as complex as I'm making it sound by trying to describe it.
I didn't have any Java on my machine at all.
Okay.
So I had to go in and do this.
Did it ask you for an Oracle account?
No, it was.
Oh.
No, it's on Linux. So.
Oh, okay, cool. I'm going to bookmark this page. All right, so you do that and you install the JDK. And only after you've got a valid JDK, try to install Eclipse. And if you try to do it first, then it tries to get you to download version 12 of Java or something weird like that. So Eclipse download, and it should be eclipse.org. And you can just go with the latest one, Eclipse IDE 2019-03. And again, I'm on Linux, so it's going to bring down a tar file that's been gzipped. But if you do this on Windows, it'll bring down an exe. And then you run the exe, and it pops up another web page, and it actually starts downloading. Eclipse is not on the machines in the Collaboratorium, because I didn't expect we were going to be doing this. So if you download this file, the exe version, and save that on a flash drive, when you boot up a machine in there, you can pop in that flash drive, run that installer, and then it just downloads Eclipse on the fly. And it's pretty quick. It takes about 3 or 4 minutes. So if you don't do this on your own machine, you're relying on the Collaboratorium PCs, it's not a bad process. But those machines reset every time that you log out, so you have to do this every time. All right, so you go through all of this and you run Eclipse. And I've got an older version of this. This is Oxygen from last year. But the newer version's got a fancier splash screen. And once this comes up, the first time that you do this, this will look different. It's gonna have a welcome screen here with a little tab on the top that you can X out. And you may have to do the following. Say window perspective, open perspective, other, and then say Java default. And then it should look something like this. Okay, so a couple of other things you have to do. You got to install the swing classes. Because as far as I know, they don't come standard in Eclipse, although one person did this and he thinks he didn't install them manually and they were there. But you can find out when you try to install. So, help, install new software. Under work with, click the box and say all available sites. And it's going to browse to see what software is available. So type filter text in here, type the word swing. And give it a few moments.
What was the action after that? After install new software?
Install new software. Come up here where it says work with and say all available sites. And then come down to the search box right below, type in swing. And you should get a few entries that say swing designer and swing designer documentation. It may look like this. Right, in which case just expand this first one, general purpose tools, and you should see swing designer. That's the main one you need. You can do the documentation too. And then go ahead and say next and just follow through on the clicking. Now these are already installed on my system. So normally this would say hide items that are installed. It won't find swing. But if it's not on there, swing will pop up, say next, and just click through. At the end of all of that, it will ask if you want to restart the IDE, say yes.
Do you need to also include the AWL?
AWT?
File? Or AWT? Yes.
No, that should get included automatically. So it'll ask if you want to restart. Go ahead and restart. You should end up with a window like this that will let you do the GUI stuff. And that's a one-time operation, right? Once you've installed it once, it stays around, unless you're on the Collaboratorium, and you got to do it every time that you boot up. But on your own machine, this will be persistent. All right. So how do we use Eclipse? So everything is based on the idea of projects. Okay, and really, really, really adhere to the idea of everything is a separate project. So PA2, that's a project. I don't know how to use scanners. I want to write some code that just uses a scanner. That's a new project. Okay, I want to play around with some linked list code, new project. Okay, if you're writing PA2 and it's got several classes, those are all part of one project. But as soon as you're going to have a different main program, start a new project. Because you can write one project with a bunch of different main programs in it, and things can get really confusing. Okay, and the idea here, it's the same thing we do with MATLAB, it's the same thing we do with Verilog, with MPLab for the 270 class, right? You always want to think of sort of a separate workspace for each thing that you're doing. Okay, so I'm going to make a new project here. So I'm going to say new Java project. I'm going to give it a name. I don't know what I'm going to call it. We'll call it Puppies because that's happy. So I have a new project going. And I broke my window, unfortunately. So I closed something I didn't want to close. Alright, so this is what it'll usually look like. You'll have projects over here. So here's the project that we're creating right now. It's called Puppies. And there's directories here, but there's nothing in those directories. Okay, so we want to make a Java class. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to say new, and I'm going to say class. And I'm going to pick my name. I'll just call it main. I want a public static void main. I can just check this box if I want. And that'll say create a public static void main string args. You want to generate comments? Sure, we'll generate comments. Okay, and then we'll just say finish. And it writes some code for me. So there's a comment block in the beginning. There's an author with my name, and I can add other comments there. And there's my main program, public static void main, inside my class. All right, so here's my one-line main program, print hello. And to run it, just click the green run button, or you can go to run and say run. So I'll click the green run button, and it executes, and there's my output. And while it was running, this little button down here turned red, and when it exits, that button goes back to gray. And that's all there is. Okay, so pretty rapid development for writing Java code. And it's got, auto completion, auto indent, and all the usual stuff, all the suggested changes to your code, and so on and so forth. So let's close this project, and let's play around with a GUI. So I'll say new Java project. I'll call this GUI test. And I'll say a file new. Okay, so now I want to create a main class, which is what's called a JFrame. Okay, JFrame is this visual object that has the buttons on the top and the title bar and all this kind of stuff. So file new, and instead of doing a class, I'm going to come down here to other, and under other, I'm going to come down to where it says window builder and expand that, and then I'm going to come down to swing designer, expand that, and there I'm going to find JFrame. And the next time I do this, those will already be expanded, so if I just keep scrolling down enough, eventually I'll find JFrame. But if you don't see it, expand window builder and then expand swing designer. So there's JFrame. I can pick a name for it, so I'll just call this Mainframe and finish with that. And I got a bunch of code. And if I run this, I've got a JFrame. And I can move it around, and I can resize it, and I can hit the little X button, and I can close it. And I've got a bunch of code. I've got 40 lines of Java code that was created for me. And there's two tabs down here. There's a source tab, which is what we're looking at. This is the source code. I can click on the design tab, and I see a visual representation of my frame. And so this is where you're going to visually lay out the thing that you want to create. Okay, this is like what we were seeing in Intellij. The section on the right here, this is where we're doing our design. The middle section is our palettes, so we can drop down, panels and buttons and labels and text fields and things like that. We can grab these and drop them in here. Over here is the properties for whatever component we have selected. So if we click on frame, frame, which is the big thing, we can see all these properties of it. So we could set the background color, for example, if we wanted it to be something different. And now when we run this, it didn't take. I don't know why that happened. Okay, ignore that. Gotta be something else going on. Alright, don't worry about that.
Is there a hammer method, or does it just run?
Just run. So Eclipse will generally compile everything as you're typing, so it's always ready to run. So the content pane, I bet we can change the color of that. So let's make that something really interesting looking. So run that, so that worked. But I'm guessing that there's some kind of system property that's overriding the color on the frame itself. Alright, so we can drop objects into here. So I can take a button and I can drop it in. And the default manager is going to force me to put this button in one of 5 locations: north, south, west, east, or center. So there's this concept of layout managers. A layout manager is a thing that controls where your components are placed. And in Intellij, the default manager was the thing that made all these little spring symbols and caused things to grow and shrink when we change the size of the window and so on and so forth. And we can do that here. We can use a grid layout or other things, but I'm going to click on absolute layout. So I'm just clicking and letting go, so that's selected. Bring my mouse in here, it should draw a green border around this area, and I'm just going to click the left mouse button. And it doesn't look like it did anything, but it changed the layout manager to be absolute. And if I look here in the properties under layout, it says absolute. Right? I could also select from this drop-down menu. We're going to stick with absolute. Once you have an absolute layout manager, you can take an object, you can put it anywhere that you want. So I want one button right there, and another button over here, and I want my third button, and it hangs after the second one for some reason, but it'll come out of it. Give it a minute. So you can drop components where you want, and that's where they stay. And this is some issue on my system because it did this earlier on the second component.
It's a really powerful job of programming, really.
Yeah.
You just get rid of chunks of our screen.
Yeah. It's the black hole. Okay. So I can drop a third button right there. And so properties, right? So this button is called button new button. This button is called button new button 1. This is called button new button 2. And there's a text field, so I can change the text on this button. And this is pretty painless. If you want to make a bigger button, you can just grab a corner and drag it, and you got a big button. And you can move it somewhere else, and so on and so forth. And if you want to connect actions to these, you can right-click and say Add Event Handler, Action, Action Performed. Buttons in particular, if you want to add an action to it, just double-click the button, and it pops you into your code right where you want to write your event handler. So we'll say, click that button, and go ahead and run that. And when I click that, it tells me I clicked that button. And it's kind of nice that it always compiles it, because when you decide to run it, you don't have to wait for it to compile. It's compiling it while we're sitting here, staring at our code, thinking about what to do next. So we're up to 63 lines of code now. And we've written one of those lines. So it's doing a lot of heavy lifting for us. So let's make this frame bigger. And let's stop this from being a totally annoying color. Make it slightly annoying. So let's put a J panel in here. So that's a container. There's a J panel, and if we want it to be bigger, we can just grab the corner and drag it out. And if we want to add a border, we can select that. We can come in here, click on the border. So if you hit the dot, dot, dot next to a property, it usually gives you a set of options. So let's add a beveled border. And now if we run this, there's what your frame looks like. Now it's an absolute layout, so if I move this, right, if things get covered up, they get covered up. If we had a more clever layout manager, right, these things would move around. We might anchor this to the right side, or we might have it grow automatically as the window expands, and so on and so forth. Absolute, you don't get any of that. And there's a few possibilities to deal with that. One, maybe that's fine. Maybe that's what you want. Maybe you just want it to look like this, and you're going to assume the window's big enough. Two, maybe you want to do some particular control. Well, when you resize the window, that generates an event. Right? So we can take this JFrame, and we can say Add Event Handler, component resized. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know what I'm doing here, okay? I haven't done this enough that I have all of these things memorized, but to me this seems like a reasonable place to be called when you change the size of the J-frame. So I'm just putting in a print message. And we're going to run this, we're going to resize the frame and see if it prints a message. If not, then I'm going to go back and look more carefully at the event handlers that we could add. But this is way more fun than reading documentation. So now when I move this, it's resizing and it's calling that code. So I could, in my resize handler, figure out how big the frame is, and I could move these buttons around or make the panel grow larger or whatever I want to do. Or I could force the frame to go back to a small size. Or I could do something random. Alright, so suppose we want to do some painting in here, so we want our own panel. So I'm going to create a MyPanel class. And we can say File, New Class, or you can just hit this little green C with a plus sign next to it. That's just a shortcut for a new class. So I'll call this MyPanel. And I'll say extends JPanel. And I'll make a public void paint graphics G. I'll call the superclass constructor. And I'll draw an oval. So it figured out the graphics class. It doesn't know where JPanel should come from, so just hover over that, do an alt, click on it. Hover on it, there we go, import panel. Alright, so this is all good to go. Go ahead and run your code, and of course it's not doing anything because this is not a MyPanel, this is a JPanel. Okay, well let's go to our mainframe, let's look at our source code. Let's look at our design. What is this panel called? It's called panel. Its class comes from Java Swing JPanel. We'd like panel to be a MyPanel. So let's go into source and let's find panel. Hey, it's right here. And instead of saying JPanel, let's just say MyPanel. Panel equals new MyPanel. Go ahead and run that. There's your drawing. So this works better for me for teaching because it does what you ask it to do and it kind of gets out of the way. And people will tell you that Intellij is a far better IDE and it's much more efficient and so on and so forth, and I believe that's absolutely true. But our goal here is not to do highly efficient production coding, right? Our goal is to learn. And Eclipse, the things that make it less efficient perhaps are the things that make it easier to get inside and work with some of these details. Like the fact that we can simply change this to construct a MyPanel and then do everything that we would normally do with a JPanel, but have it add that custom panel to the layout. So let's take our last 2 minutes and just eyeball this code. It starts with line 1 and jumps down to line 14, right? So this is code folding. There's 13 lines of code that are not being shown, and if I hover on this little plus sign, you can see what those 13 lines are. And it's import this, import that, import the kitchen sink, right? And the idea is you probably don't need to see that every time that you go to edit this file. So it hides it for you, it collapses it, and if you click on this little plus sign, it'll expand it for you. And if you don't want to see it, you can collapse it again. And that's a common feature in a lot of IDEs. So you can collapse all of that. So this is the description of our main class, which I called Mainframe. It extends a J-frame. That's a swing object. It's got a content pane. The content pane is this inner area. And that's where we're dropping all of our components. And the constructor for the mainframe does the following. basically it sets the background of the J-frame, right, because Mainframe is a J-frame, sets the background to pink. It sets the default operation when you close the frame to be exit. So that's why when you X out the corner of the J-frame, the whole program exits. It sets the XY locations and the bounds of it right here. So if I change this to 1767 and I run it, I get a much wider frame. You can also do that in the designer. And then it says, let's make a J panel. Let's set the background of that to pink. Let's set the border, so that's the outside region. And then it creates a new button with the title OO. Sets the XY coordinates and the dimensions of it. And then it adds it to the content pane, which is a J panel. And all of this, it basically creates components, sets up parameters for them, adds them to the pane. And at the very end, so this is our J panel, right? Customize it, add a border, set the dimensions, add it to the content pane. That's what the constructor of Mainframe does. So the main program, the main method, basically constructs a new mainframe, and then it calls the setVisible method. And guess what it does after that? It exits. So when I run this program, it says goodbye. My main code has exited. The main method is done, but I'm still seeing this thing, and it's still executing my listeners, and so on and so forth. So this is threaded programming. This is something we're going to talk about in a few weeks, creating a separate thread that executes things independent of what's happening in this thread, which is why this thread can exit right after it does that print. It gets to the closing curly brace and it's done. But the thread that's displaying these objects is still running. Okay, so we're out of time. So I would ask you to try to make sure you got a JDK 8 or 9 installed on your system. Download Eclipse, install that, see if you get that working. If you do, go to the help, install software, search for Swing, install that. And then tomorrow will be Open Lab. We can talk PA2, we can work on Eclipse installations or whatever else we want. Sound good? All right, I will see you next time.